What you mean, Pensacola, Alabama? Many people in the South jokingly refer to the southern portion of the state of Alabama as L.A. No, I mean lower Alabama. Some even extend that reference to include the Florida Panhandle. Now, culturally speaking, of course, the Florida Panhandle is much closer to the cultures of South Alabama and southwestern Georgia than it is to the peninsular portion of the state. So it's not such a big stretch to include the Panhandle in lower Alabama. Matter of fact, for about half of the 19th century, efforts were made on both sides of the state line to make that notion a reality. By the time the U.S. officially acquired the territories of East Florida and West Florida in 1821, American settlers had already been populating the Gulf Coast for some time. Chunks of West Florida were given to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and the rest of it was combined with East Florida to form the Florida Territory. Now, the dividing point between East and West Florida was the Apalachicola River, and that comes into play later on. Pensacola had been the colonial capital of West Florida, and St. Augustine had been the capital of East Florida. A new permanent capital was established at Tallahassee, it being roughly halfway between the two old capitals. However, even before the establishment of the Florida Territory, there were already efforts to include the Gulf Coast in Alabama. In 1811, a group of American immigrants to the area petitioned Congress to include West Florida in the Mississippi Territory, which at the time included all of Alabama. We still labor under the painful apprehension that your enlightened body will either continue us a separate territory or attach us to the territory of New Orleans instead of incorporating us with the Mississippi Territory, which we most ardently wish. In Alabama's 1819 State Constitutional Convention, lawmakers included a provision in the state constitution's preamble that would allow for the expansion of Alabama, assuming that at some point in the near future, West Florida would be ceded to Alabama as a matter of course. Residents of West Florida again petitioned Congress in 1822 for annexation into Alabama. Now, possibly because Pensacola was slowly losing some of its influence in territorial politics to St. Augustine and Tallahassee, residents there began clamoring for inclusion in Alabama, with letters in support of this being published in the Pensacola Gazette throughout the 1820s. In 1840, the Florida Territorial Senate made known its opposition to the division of Florida to allow for the Panhandle to be included in Alabama. But in the same year, the citizens of Pensacola held a large public meeting demanding separation from Florida and union with Alabama. Oddly enough, Florida's Constitutional Convention was held in St. Joseph in 1838, a town which was located just within the bounds of West Florida along the Gulf Coast. The Constitution drafted there would later become law in 1845 when all of Florida Territory, Panhandle included, would become the 27th state. A year before statehood, in 1844, the Florida legislature changed positions and decided to request that West Florida in fact be separated and allowed to join Alabama. Had this happened, the town in which Florida's Constitution was drafted would then have become part of another state. Tempers continued to flare up because of Pensacola's geographical distance from the other population centers of the state, and in 1856, influential separationists were able to push a bill through the legislature allowing for a referendum on the issue, but Governor James Broome shocked everyone by vetoing the measure. Even as the Alabama legislature tried to open negotiations with Florida 2 years later on the issue, the matter was put on the back burner as the Southern secession crisis was really beginning to loom leading up to the Civil War. After the war in 1868, the Alabama legislature finally made an official offer to buy the Florida Panhandle west of the Apalachicola River. The offer was for $1 million in Alabama state bonds, paying 8% interest over 30 years' time. In 1869, each of the counties in the affected area, except for Jackson County, conducted a referendum, with the total vote being 1,162 for and 661 against annexation into Alabama. So obviously, it was going to be a done deal. However, opposition arose in Alabama over the high price offered for the purchase, after which the legislature amazingly yielded to pressure and failed to take further action, even though the referendum showed that the Florida Panhandle voters were largely in favor of moving to Alabama. After this huge missed opportunity, the folks in the Panhandle would largely calm down about switching states. The Alabama legislature, in what I'm guessing was a bout of regret, made another couple of offers in 1873 and again in 1901, but these fizzled out rather quickly, with apparently not much response from the Floridians. Pensacola, which to this day remains the largest population center in what was once the territory of West Florida, was finally connected to the rest of the state by way of the Pensacola and Atlantic Railroad in 1883, and dozens of small whistle-stop towns sprang up along the route between there and Tallahassee. Even though much of the Panhandle still remains very much culturally and politically tied to South Alabama, it still seems that everyone on both sides of the state line is fairly content these days with the status quo, except for a couple minor mentions back in the 1980s. But who knows what the future holds? All I know is, never say never.